Yep.
So hi and welcome to today's event on a very important topic, the future of work, a topic we all care deeply about. This event is part of a series of webinars that we are organizing in the DISD, in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, to prepare the World Social Report 2025. This event is slightly different from webinars that we have organized recently, in that we have three top experts on labor market issues. Harun Burat, Richard Salmons from ILO, and Valerio Di Stefano. So I welcome the three of you, and now I'll give the floor to the director of our division, John Wilmoth, to give some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Marta. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us in this webinar, which has been organized by the Division for Inclusive Social Development in the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or UN-DESM. A special thanks to our three panelists, Richard, Harun, and Valerio, for accepting our invitation to lead today's discussion. The theme of this webinar, The Future of Work, touches on several topics of great importance. It's an issue that we all care deeply about. For better or worse, work plays a central role in our lives and in our social identities, and it will most likely continue to do so. But that is only half of the story. Work shapes not only the individual, it also shapes the society. Work, especially decent work, helps to build trust and is thus a central pillar of social cohesion. The theme is also very timely. As many of you know, the UN will convene the second World Summit for Social Development next year in 2025. It will be the third in a series of global summits convened recently by the UN member states to address current challenges and to ensure that the multilateral system is fit for the future. As many of you will recall, a commitment to full employment and decent work was one of the three principal commitments to emerge from the first World Summit for Social Development, held in Copenhagen in 1995. The other two were poverty eradication and social integration. As a result, there is a strong expectation that the world of work will be a central theme of the preparatory discussions for the summit, and that it should feature prominently in its outcomes. Since 2015, the world has had the Sustainable Development Goals, and they also include a commitment to full and productive employment and decent work for all. Yet sadly, progress towards achieving this goal remains elusive. Thus, today's theme is also disquieting, especially now when the world of work is undergoing some major transformations. There has been much attention given to a number of megatrends that are reshaping labor markets. Among the most important are climate change, global integration, technological innovation, including artificial intelligence, and the demographic transition towards longer lives and smaller families. Within this rapidly changing social context, production methods are evolving, the on-demand economy is growing, and the opportunities available for decent work are constantly changing. Now, arguably, the current transformations in the world of work form a megatrend of their own, with critical social, political, and economic implications. And I hope there will be some time today to discuss these implications. I will keep the speaker introductions short so that we can go quickly to the discussion. You can find longer bios of each speaker in the invitation to today's event. Thus, let me welcome Richard Salmons. Mr. Salmons is the director of ILO's research department, and also Harun Burat, who is professor of economics and director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And last but not least, Valerio Di Stefano, the Canada Research Chair in Innovation Law and Society at the Osgoode Hall Law School of York University in Canada. And now, without further ado, let me turn this back over to the moderator, Ms. Marta Reusch of the Division for Inclusive Social Development. Marta, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, John. So the way we will run the event is we will devote the first 60 minutes to a panel discussion with the three guests. And then we will have about 25 minutes at the end for Q&A. I recommend that you enter your questions or comments even during the discussion in the Q&A or else in the chat box, and we will post your questions at the end. So let's start, before we start future gazing, let's start with an overview of where we stand today. And here I would ask Rick to tell us, what does the latest employment outlook from ILO show? Have all regions recovered equally from the recent and ongoing crisis?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Marta and John. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar on this important topic, and with my great co-panelists here. Just in a couple of minutes, as requested, a snapshot of where the ILO sees things globally, by and large. We have revised slightly downward our projections for unemployment globally this year to 4.9%. This is on the back of more resilient growth in key parts of the world and lower than expected unemployment rate evolution in China, India, and some high-income countries. We see global unemployment in 24 as remaining below the 2019 pre-pandemic level. And that is, of course, a global picture. There is some variation among, but most regions have at least by that measure, recovered much or all of the ground that was lost during the pandemic. There's been a lot of discussion in high-income countries, some of them at least in recent months, about labor shortages, so-called labor shortages and whatnot, and whether that is a contributor to inflationary pressures and something that central banks need to worry about. As far as we're concerned, looking at the latest high-frequency data and official data that we have, we don't see that as an issue. The data point to a pretty stable situation. Job vacancies have returned to prior trends following their spike, in the year or two after the pandemic. Hence, there's no evidence that we find credible that overly tight labor markets could result in inflationary pressures and then therefore justify higher than necessary path for interest rates. Now, I've been talking at this point only about unemployment rates per se. We at the ILO and many others, including my colleagues, pay a lot of attention to broader measures of labor underutilization. We, in the last couple of years, have been putting out a so-called jobs gap estimate that includes but goes beyond unemployment per se, to include people who would like to work but don't currently work and don't necessarily qualify or meet the criteria that tend to be quite specific and somewhat narrow to be considered unemployed in official labor statistics. The latest estimates of ours indicate that the global jobs gap is around 402 million people in 2024, this year. Of these, about a half of that, 183 million, are unemployed. They meet the two technical criteria of being available at short notice and actively searching for work. Another 137 million are in the potential labor force. They meet one of these criteria, but not both of them. And 82 million are willing non-job seekers. That is, they meet neither criteria, but would be willing to work if an opportunity were readily available. And this can get fairly narrow and technical, but in particular, there are a lot of women who have other obligations that tend to fall out of unemployment rate measurements, but that would clearly like to have at least some significant amount of work. So in sum, while the unemployment rate and even this jobs gap rate has been falling and recovering ground that was lost during the pandemic, labor markets, it must be emphasized, are still characterized by very sizable employment deficits. Now, more broadly, yes, there is some variation around the world. The Arab states regions is estimated to have the highest jobs gap rate at 20.5%, followed by Africa, 17.4%. In contrast, the jobs gap rate for Asia and the Pacific is estimated at 7.5%. Now, more broadly, the lowest jobs gap rates are in high-income countries where men register a rate of 7.3% and women 9.7%. So you can see a very sizable gender disparity there. However, in developing and emerging economies, the jobs gap rate tends to be far higher, particularly for women. In low-income countries, for example, the rate for women stands at 22.8% and 15.3% for men. Results for middle-income countries present a sort of a mixed picture, an intermediate picture, with women registering sizably higher jobs gap rates than men. And we find in our work, including through some surveys of a subset of countries, that care responsibilities are significantly responsible for this gender disparity. 45 or 6% of women age 15 and above are employed, compared to 69.2% of men, and labor force participation rate gap of 23.6%. And as I say, that much of this, but it's very difficult to know with precision, but much of this is driven by the disproportionate share of care, not just of children, but otherwise in the household. And I can provide you with a little bit more detail than that, but I don't think this opening segment provides the space for that. And then finally, I would want to mention that just because one is employed, whether partially or fully, does not mean that, as Marta, you mentioned, or I think John mentioned at the top, that this is necessarily decent work. And we have seen, for example, a decoupling between growth in the economy and progress on working poverty and informality in recent years. Poverty reduction since 2015 has slowed down compared to the decade prior to the establishment of the SDGs, from 5.7% annually to only 1.4% more recently. And although the pandemic played a big role in that, this remains worrying for a number of reasons. First, it shows that the pandemic produced larger scarring effects for poverty than for economic output. And second, even before the pandemic, the slowdown was already apparent. And finally, in the pandemic's wake, geopolitical stability has impacted prices. And as some of our work released earlier in the year demonstrates, on a global basis, real wages have suffered considerably. And working poverty as well remains, progress on that has considerably slowed down. So just to conclude, despite a decrease in unemployment compared to pre-pandemic levels and previous projections, recent trends indicate a leveling off of this. There is significant resilience that we see on a global basis with considerable variation among regions. But the bottom line is labor underutilization remains a big issue for many, many countries at all, I would say, at all levels of economic development practically. And with these large employment deficits persisting, this raises a number of concerns about decent work and social justice, which perhaps we can get into a larger discussion about as this session goes on, including with respect to the policy response. Thanks, and back to you, Marta.
Thanks so much, Rick. So on unequal recovery, and then especially based on the broader measures that you have cited, and then large employment deficits that, as you say, preceded the crisis. Many of the deficits we see today have been long time in the making. And on that, I wanted first to turn to Haroon to tell us a little bit more about informal employment. the persistent and untractable problem in low and middle income countries. Now, of course, informal employment is an umbrella term for a very diverse set of labor market situations. And what actually I want to ask Harun is whether if it's becoming more diverse, if the informal employment, how is it changing? And how do you see it changing in the future? And then also, have any countries succeeded in reducing it? And what type of informal employment are they reducing?
Yeah, thanks very much, Marta, and very happy to be here. So it's interesting. I mean, the first thing to keep in mind when we talk about informality is it's the dominant form of employment in the world's labor market. So 60% of all employed in the labor force in the global labor market are actually in the informal sector. Now, often the follow-up question tends to be, well, how do you define the informal sector? And of course, according to surveys, labor force surveys in individual countries, and Rick, of course, his institution, the ILO, has done a lot of work on this. Definitions will differ. Some are registration-based, some are size-based, and so on. There is one common thing. It's a little bit like an elephant. It's difficult to describe, but when you see it, you know it's the informal sector. And I think that's instead of getting hung up on definitional heterogeneity, I think it's fair to say that we all know the informal sector when we see it, or the informally employed. So the fact that it's a dominant form of work means that we do need to have a special focus on it, particularly in low and middle income countries. So in terms of trends, long-term trends are linked at its source, Marta, to structural transformation. So if an economy is able to structurally transform in the old Lewis model away from agriculture, rural-based employment, to urban wage employment, that's sort of a successful structural transformation. And you've seen that in much of East Asia, from Japan through to China now as well, and Vietnam to some extent. That then is usually coupled with a moderate, but over the long run, if you think of South Korea and Japan, a declining share of workers in informal employment. If you, though, have stalled structural transformation, like you have in much of sub-Saharan Africa, much of Latin America, what it means is that workers move from rural areas into urban areas and end up in low productivity, urban, informal employment. And that's the dominant trend you've seen over the last few decades, which is stalled or in some cases premature deindustrialization that then results in increasing shares of workers in informal employment. For me, that's the takeaway, that the only way you're going to see changes in informal employment or movement from informal to formal employment is through greater structural transformation. Wage jobs coming on stream in manufacturing, in services, in the formal sector. There are, just to conclude, there are examples of let's call it shorter-term trends that are reinforcing informality. The growth of platform work in particular. So you have this strange sort of coupling of the fourth industrial revolution and digital jobs that also bring on stream a series of platform workers in a variety of occupations that in many cases are unprotected work, right? And so in the informal sector. The second key trend is the rise of global value chains. So the rise of global value chains further down the chain, as it were, in developing countries is often associated with greater employment in countries like Bangladesh and in sectors like textiles and others, greater employment, but coupled with enhanced informality. So that's sort of a quick whistle-stop tour of what I think is driving both informality. Let's not get hung up on definitions, but also where I think at its source, focus on structural transformation. If an economy is able to move from agriculture to manufacturing to services with a strong spine in modern services, in wage-based manufacturing, you are going to see a decline in informality. Unfortunately, that's not the base case in Africa and Latin America.
Thanks so much, Harun. And then, taking it from where you left it, at the same time, we are observing a trend towards more precarity in the world of work in countries that have gone through this, that went through this structural transformation a long time ago. And here is when I want to turn to Valerio to ask about high-income countries. And for those expecting some talk about AI and other digital transformations, we are getting there. I want to start though by asking Valerio, are long-term contracts, full-time jobs, long-term contracts, a thing of the past in high-income countries? Are we seeing more precarity in the world of work?
So they are not a thing of the past, okay? So standard employment, which is defined as a job that is open-ended, full-time for an employer that is clearly recognizable, those jobs are not in decline, and we have seen in the last couple of decades a growth in countries like India or China of those kind of jobs. But at the same time, yes, in richer countries, we have also experienced an increase in the prevalence of non-standard form of employment. So everything that departs from that paradigm of full-time open-ended. So we have seen part-time jobs, we have seen casual jobs, we have seen temporary agency jobs, fixed-term jobs. Those have all grown in the past as well in richer countries. And one of the problems with this growth is that we say the standard employment relationship because that is the relationship around which we have built regulation for work. Okay, so normally any legislation around the world, any labor law or employment law legislation is built around the idea of an open-ended full-time job. And everything that departs from that paradigm in legislation tend to fall through the cracks. So this is what the problem is, that in many cases the regulation has not followed suit with this increasing trend of more precarity and more non-standard jobs. In general, I mean, the ILO has produced now in 2016, so it's a bit dated, but the data are still relevant, a report on non-standard employment around the world. And that report documents that non-standard workers face worse when it comes to wages, when it comes to security, when it comes to occupational health and safety, when it comes to all the fundamental principles and rights of work of the ILO. They present clear challenges in accessing decent work, if we want to use an ILO concept. So a non-standard job doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but the problem is that, and we're probably going to talk about it later on, the policies around non-standard jobs have not followed suit. And so we have stuck with a lot of the legislation that we have adopted in the past, and we have not updated in order to protect these people better. And I want to be very clear, I'm not one of those people that thinks that to protect non-standard workers, we have to reduce protection of standard workers. It doesn't work like that. We have absolutely no evidence that that should be the case. And again, the ILO has done a great job in the past in documenting that. But I think, yes, we are seeing an increase in more precarious jobs in richer countries. And this is, in many cases, a failure of policy. There is no real need for that additional precarity. We have not updated our laws to protect these people better and to take care of some of the challenges that they face.
Okay, so there's a mismatch between policies and the reality of the world of work, something that we can talk more about in a few minutes when we talk about policy. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you, Valerio, but also the other two participants, how has digitalization affected these changes that you have just described? Is the spread of what we call non-standard forms of work due to the growth of the gig economy? Is that what is driving the increase of non-standard jobs? I have a follow-up question, but go ahead.
Well, no, this is a great question. The short answer is no. Digitalization did not, so the growth of non-standard work has been around for 40 years, okay? So digitalization is just the last iteration of that. Non-standard work has not been caused by digitalization. What happened, though, is that precisely because of those loopholes in the policy, it has been easy to use technology to strip people of the protection they deserve. And I reconnect with what Aaron was talking about a few moments ago. Platform work is a clear example of that. It's a clear example of people that should be covered by employment and labor protection. We should not really have a debate about whether someone who drives pizzas around town should be covered by labor law. That should not be a question. But somehow digitalization and technology have been used to sort of raise a fog curtain that conceals the reality of work behind the tech facade. So in that sense, digitalization, this part of digitalization, there are also very positive, of course, results of digitalization. But this part of digitalization, again, has met with this sort of policy mismatch or policy failure, in which basically the technology side has been used to precarize people, to strip people of protection, even when there was absolutely no need to strip them of those protection.
Great, thanks so much. So a non-deterministic approach. It has been used in a certain way, the digital transformation, but it did not have to, or it does not have to. But overall, I mean, obviously technology is altering the way in which we work and how work is performed and managed. And so that's exactly what I want to ask you, Valerio, but also open the discussion for the other two participants. How is technology changing the way in which it's performed and managed? We have more flexibility now on where we work, on when we work, on who we work for. So what is that happening and what are the implications of that?
So again, I think that the answer is that we may have more flexibility and autonomy, but digitally, I mean, some technologies are also being used to increase work discipline and to increase control and micromanagement on workers. There's a lot of technologies out there that are automating the jobs of bosses rather than automating the jobs of workers. Increasingly, hiring is outsourced to machines. The managing of job interviews, monitoring productivity, monitoring workplaces, it's all being, if you want, outsourced to computer with very problematic implications, because most of the technologies that have now been used in the world of work to monitor and manage people are very faulty. In many cases, they go under the hype of artificial intelligence, and instead they are basically AI snake oil. There's no AI involved. It's not much more than glorified spreadsheets that affect working lives very heavily. So this is something that we have seen. And again, we can use and we should use digitalization and technology to liberate us, to allow us to work from everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. But what we've seen, for instance, during the pandemic, when remote work was a reality that couldn't be escaped, is that, again, in many companies, and especially in the bigger companies, but also in small and medium enterprises, managers have sort of gone into this panic buying frenzy of these proctoring devices for their employees that, again, are a very big hurdle to productivity and increase stress, increase the amount of work that has to be done. And in many cases, it's make work, it's not productive work. So it should be a high time that we have a more open discussion on the kind of technologies that we implement in our workplaces, because technology can liberate us, but the problem is that it's not doing that at the moment.
Okay, I see both Harun and I think Rick want to speak. I just want to, yes, there's more opportunities for control. There's also more opportunities for flexibility. Workers may want this flexibility. Do they want this flexibility? And what does this flexibility imply? Are they trade-offs to flexibility? Anyway, I don't know if Harun or Rick go first. Harun has had his hand up.
Sure. So just to complement what Valerio said is, I think there's almost a three-part segmentation of technology's impact on the labor market. So the standard early part of at least the evidence we had, which is now well known, certainly on the sort of task-based measures of employment, that technology went after and hollowed out the middle of the occupational distribution. So all these routine tasks, jobs in manufacturing and so on were being replaced by machinery and technology and so on. But I think what we haven't really concentrated on enough is the consequences for workers at the top end of the distribution, at the bottom end. Both categories of workers have seen an increase in demand, so platform work, right, delivery, pizza delivery, and so on, but also at the top end for IT type workers. Now, at the top end, wages are really high, and workers are mobile, and workers are skilled. And so flexibility is actually what workers or these employers often seek, right? And so arguably non-wage benefits, location of work is less important. And in fact, the greater the flexibility, the better for these workers. We can talk and debate about that. But the bottom end, even though you've had increase in demand for bottom end workers or workers in the bottom half of the occupational distribution, there's incredible insecurity. And that's really the challenge, right? So it's the pizza delivery person, at least in many developing countries, where it's dangerous work, right? Accidents, very little non-wage accidents happen frequently because workers don't have protective gear. Employers do not offer it. Non-wage benefits are not offered. Leave days and so on. So that for me is technology's dark side, as it were, right? In terms of its impact on the labor market. And I think that's a really important aspect to keep in mind.
So flexibility with insecurity, and a hollowing up out of the middle or bottom, but we don't know if this is going to be with AI. We don't know if the impacts in the labor market are going to be the same. But first, Rick.
Yes, let me build a bit on Harun's point here about the digital technology increasingly implicating a wider range of occupations beyond those that are very labor intensive and repetitive or menial. We have about almost a year ago, put out a piece of work doing some initial estimates of the exposure of various occupations to a ChatGPT type of generative AI technology. And while, yes, the occupation that looks most exposed are clerical support workers, there are quite a number of other, what you might think of as higher value added or higher productivity and more highly remunerated occupations that also looked fairly exposed here to this technology. Technicians and associate professionals, service and sales workers, and even managers are among the most highly exposed by our analysis, whether at a very high or a moderate level of exposure to this technology. So this is a very fast developing picture. The topic that we're talking about right now, the potential effects of advanced digital technology on work. And we've tried to break that down by taking a look more specifically at the potential of various occupations for either applying the this technology to improve its productivity or being substituted by the technology. And here, while we see at this is, I have to say, very preliminary estimate, we see that augmentation looks to swamp the number of occupations that are likely to be substituted for, or work that is substituted for by this technology. Nonetheless, even those that are have the potential to be augmented, that is for workers in those particular jobs to be able to use the technology to do some of the tasks that they're responsible for in a more efficient, effective way, and therefore be able to add more value and potentially be better compensated for the value they're adding as a result of technology. When you step back from this entire picture, you see that about, we see about 10 to 20% of the workforce being quite significantly exposed to one or the other, augmentation or automation. And that implies, a very significant additional degree of churn in the workforce. That is either people losing their jobs and needing to find a new one, or people needing to run faster and learn more to keep up and remain competitive in their existing job. And all of that has big implications, I think, for fiscal and labor market policies more generally. A growing, it's an opportunity for better remuneration, less working time, higher productivity on the one hand, but it is a very significant, at the same time, potential risk for society and for labor markets more generally. So maybe I'll stop there, but I agree certainly with the analysis articulated by Valerio earlier on, that this is not necessarily brand new. I think this is something to be seen as an evolution of a trend that has been going on for quite a while, which has a number of different roots in the changing nature of the economy. Back to you.
Thank you. We could continue talking about this, but I would like to continue talking, but move about the role that policy is playing. Valerio mentioned that there's a mismatch. I call it a mismatch between current policies and the reality of the world of work today. Can we dig a little bit deeper into this? And one question I have is, there have been several waves of deregulation of the labor market in the past decades, to lower labor costs and to lower the protections that workers have. So were these waves of deregulation an inevitable consequence of this technological revolution and also of global integration? Were they or not? And the question goes to all of you.
I can start if you want, Marta. And so I'm a lawyer, and I am very skeptical of any time any labor reform is presented as inevitable. Okay, there is no inevitability of labor reforms, and there is no inevitability of the direction of those reforms. So those were, again, policy choices. And for a number of decades, actually, we have seen the prevalence of a certain consensus in the international sphere. And I mean, again, the ILO was one of the outlier, and it was always a voice to caution against this consensus that in order to grow, we should have deregulated labor markets. But I, as a lawyer, the only thing I can say, and I leave the rest to the other panelists that certainly are more qualified than me to answer, is just I want to caution, there is no inevitable reforms. Reforms occur because they are piece of policy. They don't enact themselves. They get enacted. So someone wants them and they get enacted. They are never inevitable.
And perhaps some countries have been done better than others. Not all countries are regulated at the same pace, right? Which proves that, and even countries that were equally exposed to global integration or to technological innovation. So
that is true. I mean, we have seen, if we're talking about richer countries, we have seen a wave of deregulation along the financial crisis of 2010, 2011. In many European countries in particular, there was the opportunity, the chance that certain political paths could push certain deregulatory measure that were not necessarily based on evidence. Again, the idea was, we have a problem of unemployment, let's cut or let's allow more fixed-term jobs. And unsurprisingly, it never works in the way that those reforms are promised. Those reforms don't necessarily work in the way that they are presented. And actually, we've seen in some countries, like I can think of Portugal or Spain, they have reversed trends in the last years and had very good results. So again, there's nothing inevitable. There's nothing set in stone. That's the only contribution a lawyer can bring is this one.
Harun?
Yeah, so my sense is yes, you can debate sort of so cross-country evidence, whether you've seen a trend towards deregulation or not. It depends on the country. And in some cases, specific forms of deregulation may have specific economic outcomes. For me, in the developing country context, the real debate actually is about enforcement. And so in many ways, what you have in many middle-income countries, low-income countries, is a fairly, let's call it standard regulatory environment governing the labor market, right? Both in terms of hiring and firing clauses and so on. But it's the enforcement that is particularly weak. And there are all sorts of reasons for it. And so you can look at, say, the normal distribution for wages in a minimum wage setting, a country that has a national minimum wage, and there isn't a spike like you find in advanced countries. What you have is, in some countries, 40–50% of workers are actually below the national minimum wage. That's a violation of the law, and these are formal sector workers. And so in many ways, the debate about the regulatory architecture in developing countries is about enforcement capacity, the willingness to enforce the law. Debates are around what Ravi Kanbur and others call turning a blind eye. So politicians using, let's call it, worker-friendly legislation to get elected, and so the legislation is in place, but in fact turn a blind eye to the enforcement and the application of the law. And lots of work has been done by the ILO. And a lot of us around the extent of particularly minimum wage and non-wage violation in the developing world. So I think for me, that's a really important aspect outside of the regulatory architecture that's set, is to what extent are these standards, are these pieces of legislation, hiring and firing clauses actually enforced in these contexts.
Yeah, and if I could, Marta, I would say that this is a pretty secular problem. I think Harun would agree. You look around the world and countries that are low, middle income, you actually see, for the most part, fairly good law on the books. But you see very limited institutional capacity in the various aspects of monitoring, inspection, adjudication of disputes, insurance that there's the social institutions of social dialogue, that those mechanisms work. This is the problem is that neither in domestic fiscal policy choices, nor in particular in development assistance funding allocation choices by donor agencies, whether bilateral or multilateral, is it well understood and absorbed that the institutional capacity to effect and apply the legal framework around decent work, legal, labor market protections, but you could also extend that to social protections. That institutional capacity is sort of an afterthought of development assistance, and it's also very much struggling domestically in countries for table scraps. I mean, I'm being a little dramatic and metaphoric in this regard, but it's just not viewed as a central driver of poverty reduction. It's viewed as sort of a peripheral issue, a subordinate priority relative to other areas. And I think that's one of the most important things. Yes, as this discussion thus far has indicated, there is an important new emerging unfulfilled agenda for norm creation. The economy is changing. Norms need to catch up. People need to understand that it's not just going to happen like Valerio said. It's going to require some intentionality, some agency, and some cooperation and coordination, because some of the new tools, the digital tools in particular, they scale and span borders. So there's going to be a need for an added degree of international cooperation in this regard. But at least as important is the point that Harun and his colleague Ravi Kanbur and some of their excellent research in this area are making, and that is that the capacity for the institutions of work to actually work, it's got to be viewed as a more central element of a development strategy. And that needs to be better absorbed by the economics community itself, which it's tended not to be. And it needs to be understood much better by the development community, which is all aligned toward poverty reduction goals. And that there's a constant refrain of an understanding that employment is central to sustainable poverty reduction in countries. But there's a poor translation of that into resource allocation choices. Thanks.
Yeah, so Rick, as you said, labor market policies and institutions are just but one element of development, broader development policies, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But first, I wanted to get, yes, you've passed the message very clearly. There are problems with implementation and particularly with enforcement. But I wanted to get back to the norm creation that you just mentioned, Rick, because even in the design of policies, are the current policies fit for the future of work as you see it? Or, okay, this is a yes or no question. Let me put it differently. How should norms change in order to be ready for what we think is coming, what we see now in the world of work and what we think is coming? And the question goes to all of you. Anyone wants to start?
Well, maybe I'll start on this one. Clearly there's, as I just mentioned, there is a need for serious work domestically, internationally be done about how to adapt and update various aspects of labor law. And even the things that everybody has signed up to, including the fundamental principles and rights at work and how they should be better applied to a changing world of work. Now, the ILO as a multilateral tripartite organization is a standard setting organization, but our processes, because of its universal nature, are often rather slow and deliberate, and may follow and build from rather than precede, in many cases, what's happening at the national level. Nonetheless, the first step at our level, which you might think of as new norm creation in this digital domain, it will happen over the next couple of years in respect of the platform economy. It's very difficult to project exactly how that will turn out, what first steps will be taken. But there is agreement to undertake a 2-year process of potential norm creation in respect of certain aspects of the platform economy. Then beyond that, this discussion has already flagged a number of other issues which we ourselves also from a research perspective raise as begging the question about whether there should be a deepening or a broadening of labor protection related norms. And I'll just re-summarize some of them, is that digital tools, algorithmic automation, generally speaking, looks like absent some additional protections or extension of existing protections to these specific circumstances, it looks like it could very well, for many people in the world, be a force for added commodification of their work. And this is a founding principle of our institution. Labor people who do work are not commodities, but this technology, in the way it's applied, really does beg that question in many respects, not generally, because I have to emphasize the productivity enhancing aspects of these technologies are also a big opportunity, but regulation is just important for capturing that opportunity, I would say. But then just a few elements. So recruitment. These tools are being used to screen resumes that come in. And that raises questions about whether the human should be in the loop on that at some point. And whether the tools should be subject to some degree of interrogation, the ability of people to interrogate them. So transparency as a guard against bias. Same thing goes with performance evaluation. The tools are increasingly being used as an efficiency device for performance evaluation. Now, again, you can argue both sides. You can say, well, this may take some of the bias out of the process for recruitment and performance evaluation by having an algorithm which, make an evaluation against a certain set of criteria. But there's just as much opportunity in principle for there to be bias in a way that might very much frustrate the objectives of fundamental rights. The tasking of work. The algorithm may allocate work differently to different types of workers, depending on what criteria, same issues arise. The protection of a growing degree of employee data. Who owns that data? What restrictions should be placed around that? I mean, there's pretty advanced understanding in many countries about the treatment of health-related data, whether of employees or other people. But as algorithms monitor, evaluate, task work, it's gathering a lot of data about people, often in their homes, because a lot of work is moving to the home. And so that raises privacy questions, So here's another area where I think very quickly, as people delve more deeply into it, it begs the question of whether there should be added protections that are statutorily or grounded or based in rulemaking processes of relevant agencies in countries. I could go on, but this is just a bit of a sample. OSH-related, occupational safety and health implications. As the tools make people run harder, workers run harder, and be less secure and have less of a zone of privacy in the way they figure out how to best allocate the time they commit to their work, there are potential occupational safety and health issues that you can certainly see already coming up in a lot of the increased pace of work in many logistics facilities these days, where the work is more easily monitored. So yes, I think there's a large potential agenda for the refinement and potential extension of regulation. And I'm not even getting here to another aspect of this, which is if there's going to be increased churn in labor markets of people needing to find other work or having more well-wired into their careers a process of learning, what's the agenda for regulation on that front? There's the notion of a just transition needs to go from a pure concept into a working framework that treats people not as commodities, but as people, skills, assets to be nurtured. And I'll close with the final thought here, that most of the value of listed companies in the world is now not a function of tangible capital, but rather intangible capital. And a major subset of that, of intangible capital, basically are the skills and the loyalty and the motivation and creativity of people. And so, if we don't get this right, if we don't adapt labor protections to this changing nature of the economy, we risk undermining not just people's agency and dignity and rights, but also potentially the productivity of our economies.
Valerio and Harun, would you like to add anything before we move on to a final set of questions? This is a big question. It's a very large question. Harun, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Just very quickly to complement Rick's points. I mean, I think, especially if you think about norms and standard setting, right? Policymakers think of the regulation side and don't think about enforcement. So in the first order response is to actually provide the information about violation of laws and the extent to which enforcement is a challenge. I think that already will begin the process of norms and standard setting. The other thing is the regulation can help. So some of the work we've done for South Africa shows that even though the minimum wage is still being violated, if a minimum wage is set, workers and employers move closer up to the minimum wage, right? So, and still below it, so still officially violating, but the gap between the wage that they currently pay and the minimum wage actually narrows. So you can nudge standard settings through regulation, and I think that's a really important starting point, right? So it becomes a process of actually shifting an entire labor market towards the norm and the standard. The final point, which I think Rick referred to as well, is companies and companies are using the ruse of outsourced workers. If again, we take the pizza delivery person, right? He or she is effectively an outsourced worker, and companies are absolving responsibility for standard setting and worker benefits and so on. However, if consumers, right, are brought on board, or companies see this as a preferential competitive advantage to show that they're treating their workers really well, their drivers and so on, that can also influence norms and standard setting.
Thank you, Harun. If Valerio wants to speak, right? Quickly, and then we move on.
No, let's move on.
Okay, let's move on to the last set of questions, because John said in his introductory remarks that he wanted to have some time to talk about the implication of all this labor market transformation. So that's the question I want to have around the notion of the social contract. So if all the transformations that you have described seem to have weakened the relationship between workers and employers and governments, okay, with the growing employment insecurity, what are the, and if I think this relationship between workers, employers, and governments was key to the social contracts of industrialized countries, was a key dimension of the social contract in the 20th century. So what are the implications what we are seeing now for the social contract? It's a big question. I can break it down here. What are the likely implications of what we are seeing for people's trust in institutions? We are seeing increasing political polarization in many industrialized countries. What do changes in the world of work have to do with this trend towards political polarization, people voting for fringe parties, increasingly declining trust in institutions, and even declining trust in other people?
Can I say something about that? I think one of the issues that we have to start to care more about is the extent and the autonomy and agency that people have at work. We live in an era in which autonomy and agency are crucial. And again, digital tools have given us the impression that we can do everything with the tap of our fingers. And still, for many people around the globe, once they walk into their workplace, they are subject to inordinate amounts of authority and micromanagement from their bosses, their managers, and this is not because bosses or managers are evil. It's just the way in which we have, if you want, interiorize the idea that work should be something where someone bosses people around and then people are bossed around. It's probably time that we reconsider this paradigm. It's probably time that we reconsider the extent to which managers can order people to do things that are not necessarily related to their strict work performance. There's too much authority in our labor relations at the moment, and that's probably something that we have to take care of if we want to avoid that people, again, resort to populism, et cetera, et cetera. There's a study, it was a preliminary study from some foundation in Germany that correlates the lack of autonomy at work with voting for populist parties. And I think we have to look much more into that.
Harun?
I mean, just to complement that, and I mean, it is a big question, Marta. It's a difficult one. And again, it depends on the country context. I mean, to some extent, and I'm generalizing across the developing world, a combination of the rise in precarious work, right? And that's a function not just of growing informality, but also forms of work within global value chains and so on that have seen reduced standards of labor and so on, has resulted in a weakened trade union movement. And so in many ways, what used to, if you like, close the social contract was a strong trade union movement that could act as an interface between employers and workers. there's a really interesting case of a local South African retailer that used to have a very strong union. It's almost a case of be careful what you wish for. Had a very strong trade union, but because of changes in outsourcing of certain functions within the retail sector and so on, the trade union became much weaker. The company is now faced with local politicians who are now trying to negotiate for back pocket deals and so on, in addition to supposedly hire workers for wages. Right, it's become disorganized. The company is now involved in trying to rebuild the trade union. The company is involved in trying to rebuild the trade union. So in other words, as these social contracts break down, you induce so much instability that in fact, there's a preference to go back to the stability that was of old. And I think that's an interesting journey, right? I mean, this is one case study, but it's an interesting journey in other countries where perhaps even government could intervene to assist in rebuilding these institutions so that the social contract can live on.
You know, Marta, I'd say, you know, just to take a different angle on this very large question. You could look at what's happened over the last 40 or 50 years and say, well, we've had you know, a supply side agenda that has improved the efficiency of resource allocation. That's partly a policy story, domestically, internationally, integration, deregulation, privatization. But it's also a technology story. Things have moved on, and technology tools have made scaling of business models easier, and it's made it easier for firms to penetrate and to offload, outsource, meter and compartmentalize different aspects of their value creation strategy. All of that from a social perspective has the potential, and in many cases has had the contribution of improving growth, what I would call the quantity of growth, production. But at the same time, it has had an aggregate effect in many economies of increasing the level of insecurity or precarity on the one hand, and increased inequality in the distribution of outcomes, and increased also a degree of churn or dislocation. And these are all socially matters of concern. And so that's how I would think in the broadest possible way about your question about, well, what is the social contract? How does it need to adapt? And I think we're in a grand debate, if it's more implicit than explicit, in rebalancing those two sets of forces, if you will. We at the ILO in the last couple of years have tended to break this down into four categories. We call these four kind of operational dimensions of social justice. One is fundamental rights and capabilities, basic capabilities or agency and dignity of people. Second is actual employment opportunity. It's one thing to have a right to work, as is enshrined in the Universal Declaration, and countries are committed to legally to the progressive realization of a right to work for everybody in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's another thing entirely for that to be that opportunity, that equality of opportunity, to be practically available. Thirdly, some degree of fairness in distribution. And then fourth, a newer concept in the long arc of discussion about social contract, which is just transitions. If there is going to be, with the greater application of market forces, a correlative increase in transitions of various sorts in the world of work, then that also needs to be thought about structurally as an element of the social contract and the response. So we are engaged in the ILO in a multi-year deeper examination of this, and an encouragement to all parties to think more ambitiously and in a more connected way about the need to renew or strengthen social contracts, which was indeed the title of the report of our Director General to our recently concluded annual ministerial tripartite conference, which we call the International Labor Conference, which I commend to people's attention if they want to read more about the question that Marta has just raised. But I do think, I'll finish this thought by just saying that I believe that, for the reason of all these secular forces that we've been discussing, and I've tried to very quickly summarize here, there's a need for a greater investment in people in these 4 dimensions of social justice. And that is what would yield a stronger social contract, if you will.
Thank you, Rick. There's a lot more we could continue discussing on this, starting with the supply side story and the role that macroeconomic policy has played in the trends we see. But we have 23 minutes left, and I would like for the audience to be able to participate and ask their questions. I wanted to ask my colleagues Simon or Luisa whether we can let participants ask their own questions, or if I have to ask them myself on their behalf.
We can let them answer.
Yes, okay. There are some questions in the chat. I don't know if the persons who asked the questions, there's one question on the ILO Global Commission on the future of work, which put a report 5 years ago, and I think it would be a very interesting question to start the discussion. I don't know if the person who asked the question wants to.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Matthew Koniak. I am new at DISA and coming from the ILO, detached from the ILO to UN DISA, and so I was following closely the discussions 5 years ago on the future of work, and I'm just curious to see maybe your view, Rick, or other panelists, as to whether the recent events that have happened in the past 5 years, I'm thinking COVID, I'm thinking the growth of AI and maybe some other social political events, have turned upside down that report, or are we still sticking very much by its big lines and what it was leading us to? Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Rick or other participants?
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased because I was a member of that commission, I suppose, but I would say no. I think that agenda is more appropriate than ever. Basically, for participants here, to boil down that Blue Ribbon Commission's report into the basic notion that sort of where I ended my last comment, which is that there's a need to increase investment in people in 3 key dimensions. One is their capabilities and protections. Second is in the institutions of work. We talked earlier about the limitations of institutional capacity, about to create and apply norms, for example, in social protection systems in particular. And then thirdly, in employment, there's a huge underemployment problem in the world economy, particularly in developing countries and particularly among youth, I would add. And what is required is for countries to understand that not only is this needed to adapt our economies better to the changes in the world of work, the so-called future of work, but actually, I would argue, and I've argued this in a book that I recently published, that we need to change our basic conception of macroeconomic policy and theory, indeed, to understand that these dimensions of, if you will, policy and regulatory enablers of investment in people and better distribution, sustainability, and resilience, which is a very different agenda than production per se, which is the main focus of macroeconomic theory and policy. These 2 things need to be brought into better balance. We need to formalize this other very significant dimension, the enablers, the institutional policy enablers of inclusion and sustainability and resilience. And that is the pathway toward a rebalanced growth and development model that has within it the core of what that Global Commission report outlined, which is a shift in the allocation of resources toward more investment in people per se, and not so focused per se on trying to optimize the quantity of growth. It's actually about the living standards of people rather than the production of stuff as measured at market prices per se.
Thank you, Valerio. On the same question.
Yes, thank you. I think that one of the most important things that the Global Commission came up with in the report is the notion of a universal labor guarantee. And that is absolutely central. What is the universal labor guarantee? It is the idea that basic labor protection should apply to everyone, regardless of employment status, including working time protection, including occupational health and safety, including minimum wage protection, which is something that at the moment we don't have in our labor markets. At the moment, our labor markets are structured along a divide. And whether you are, if you are an employee, you get the protection. If you are a self-employed, you don't get any protection, or you get very limited protection. The problem is that, again, since all of the things that we have talked about in the first part of this conversation, the growth of people that are in a condition of self-employment but are absolutely not capable of bargaining by themselves and need labor protection has grown. And the gig economy, platform work are a paramount example of that. But this is not by any means limited to that. There's too many fake freelancers around the world that don't get enough protection, or the protection they should get. So the universal labor guarantee, I think, is something that we have to revisit. And as we move towards a much more universalistic coverage of labor and employment protection. And again, as a lawyer, the contribution I can give to this debate is that the protection are not devised in a way that, again, should be set in stone. No one says that only employees should be covered by the minimum wage. It's not written in any holy scripture. It's a policy that we have devised at a certain moment of time, and right now it's not working anymore. So we should definitely move towards a more universalistic approach.
Noted. We have several hands up. I wanted to make a comment on this, but let's let people speak. Julia had a question. Julia Ferrer?
Hi, thank you, Marta. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this and for these very interesting ideas. My question is that I work in UN DISA on population aging. I would love to ask about that, but actually what I'm curious about is your view on how to ensure that governments can anticipate the changes that are coming from private sector employers. And I ask this because my impression is that very often the UN governments, we are catching up to what's happening in the private sector, especially when it comes to changes in digital platforms, etc. So how can governments anticipate, rein this in, and how can international organizations such as the UN, ILO, assist governments in that task? Thank you.
And what's the role of the international community, perhaps adding right to the question?
Yes. What's the role of the international community and governments? How can they anticipate these changes and not be in catching up mode?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if my colleagues don't want to jump in, I'll defer to you, Haroon, if you want to go first.
No, I think that's for you, Rick. You go first.
Okay. Let me say something that might seem a little out of left field, as we would say in sports terminology. You know, the world is used to having a system in which the standard fiscal, monetary, and financial stability considerations are the subject of a regular surveillance process and sort of international organization technical advisory process, if you will. This is most structured in the form of the IMF's Article 4 consultations with countries. What we do not have, despite what I would argue to be the equally important imperative of understanding how the institutional and legal and policy environment for translating economic activity into meaningful progress on a broad-based level in people's lives and their decent work and living standards, various dimensions. We don't have an analogous technical analysis and policy advisory surveillance process to benefit governments around the world on a regular basis. So in my view, the international economic cooperation and governance setup of the world is fundamentally unbalanced. And I'm saying this because you asked the question, what can the international organizations do better to help people? Yeah, I could give you an answer about, well, we're providing technical assistance in this or that, and yeah, we do great analysis on this. But the reality is that and this is a point I make in this book, Human-Centered Economics, the Living Standards of Nations, that we're not set up to support in a structural, systematic way countries that would like to have an expert scan and peer contextualization of the strength of their social contract enabling legal setup and institutional capacity for these key dimensions, and the way that we are set up to advise them and analyze how they're doing on their fiscal stability, their financial stability, and their monetary system stability. And I believe that's where the world needs to go. There's a lot of lip service paid to wanting to rebalance the growth and development model, that we want to make growth more inclusive and sustainable and resilient. Well, if we were serious about that, we would support, we meaning the international community, would support countries much better. Many countries have great capacity domestically to do some of this analysis, but they would benefit by having a joined up international process that enabled them to see how they measured up in certain key aspects of this, the strength of their social contracts, if you will, as translated into law and institutional capacity and policy incentives relative to their peers. If you're a middle-income country or lower middle-income country relative to other lower middle-income countries and the like. And so I kind of go through this in the book. It's part of a much larger story that I go through, where I basically argue that the profession itself is kind of looking at economies through one eye. It's kind of like one eye closed. If what you understand as the bottom line of national economic performance is median progress in household living standards, that improvement in people's lives, that's what economics is supposed to be about, not just about producing more stuff as measured by GDP. That's important. Don't get me wrong. It's just not sufficient. It's necessary. And we're not set up to support countries well in the international economic cooperation. Well, in part because the economics profession has been, particularly last several decades, has been schooled to focus very tightly on the production side of the economy and the efficiency agenda, which is important, but is not anywhere near the full story.
Okay, should we move on to the next question? Ismail?
Yeah, can you hear me, Martha?
Yes.
Yes, so first of all, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today, which I think really enrich our understanding of this critical issue that we are discussing. I have a question for Arun. I think that the logic behind structural change is the need to increase labor productivity growth. But some question the growing share of workers in the service sector to the detriment of agricultural sector. So wouldn't it be much better to reform agricultural sector so that to increase productivity in that sector, which I think is so important for so many low-income countries, in particular in Africa? Thank you.
Sure. So I think you do both, Ismail. So I think raising productivity in agriculture in Africa in particular, I mean, has a whole series of, I mean, it's not my area of research, but there's a whole series of interventions required to improve productivity in agriculture, right? And it's everything from fertilizers, soil quality, getting marketing boards sorted out, institutions matter, pricing matters, and so on. Insertion into global value chains, trade standards. So I think fixing productivity in agriculture should be an additional track to, if you like, thinking more carefully about the process, because the main thing about structural transformation is this natural movement of people to cities in search of jobs. And so I don't think that's going to be stemmed quite easily by fiat or any other way. So as long as people are moving into cities in search of jobs, I think the challenge is on urban-based sectors, mainly manufacturing, construction, the secondary sectors, to absorb these individuals into low-wage or lower-wage formal employment. And of course, you've seen some examples, particularly in Africa, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, to some extent, Zambia. But it is a challenge. And so in the process of both raising productivity in agriculture to make agriculture more productive and export orientated, I think an equal focus needs to be on providing a greater base for private sector wage jobs in African cities.
Thank you, Harun. So while there are no more questions right now, so I can take advantage of that to ask my own question. And if you have, we can have 5 more minutes if you can stay. My question has to do, so at least in the UN, in discussions about the current transformations in the world of work, there is a lot of emphasis on the need for skill upgrading of workers, given how change, especially in terms of the digital transformation. Actually, there's a unique focus in some meetings, there are a unique focus on that, on the need for training and skills upgrading. It seems to me that based on what you have been saying during the last hour and 20 minutes, skill upgrading is not enough. The onus cannot be put on workers only. There's much more into the picture. There are changes in the ways in which work is done and organized and in contracts. So I think it's a comment that I'm making, but I want to see if you agree with it, that we have to get away from the discourse that focuses uniquely on skill upgrading and training. What do you think?
I would fully second your proposition there, Marta. You know, in the globalization debates, and often in the technology debates, you know, the implications for society, the 2 primary responses at a surface level are, well, we've got to train people better, we've got to invest more in skills, and we've got to help the losers also, quote unquote, in the sense of basically helping them through you know, a job loss situation and whatnot. You know, or we've got to provide a fiscal transfer, you know, to them, income maintenance, as the case may be. And they're both correct. These are 2 aspects of the social contract or that need to be strengthened in this changing world of work, but they're just a series of the agenda that's required. There's a far larger set of levers that really strongly affect real economy investment, creation of employment, the assurance that employment comes with certain protections that empower people, that give them dignity, that protect their basic rights, that also do a range of other things, you know, improve infrastructure that people have better access to markets for their employment services, that address some of the real gaps that people have in their basic capabilities beyond their skills. For many countries, developing countries, people are undernourished, or they don't have adequate water, and that therefore they spend much of their productive time available basically trying to provide the basic necessities of life, where they have extremely unequal access and therefore widely disparate costs, money that they have to pay for these things. So there's a large panoply of areas that require attention policy. And this is sort of an argument I make, is that I argue there are 5 key dimensions of household living standards, and I map the areas of policy that strongly enable those, that help to ensure that there is a diffusion of opportunity and the benefits of expanded economic activity to people's lived experience. And it's that wider set of things beyond, including skilling and including some of the basic types of transfer payments that people point to, but going well beyond it, as you suggest.
Harun, what are you going to?
Yeah, just to add to Rick's point, because I think that's exactly right, that, training is important, but it's certainly not the only determinant, right? Of better employment prospects. The one that we often miss as a category in these kinds of debates is the supply side of the economy. So for governments to create an enabling environment for the private sector to actually generate employment, right? And those can be everything from infrastructure to regulation, to subsidies, credits, and so on. And I think often we overlook that as a key entry point for employment absorption. So the whole sort of what I call supply side economics of a good type that generates employment is really, really important relative to the supply side of the economy, relative to sort of the standard sort of labor market analysis, which looks at training and so on.
Valerio?
Yes, I wanted to come back on this question of skills, because again, yes, training and skills are important, but in a way, the skills discourse has been weaponized to sort of remove attention from the fact that you have to better the condition of work that are existing. And you cannot just say, well, if only those people had better jobs, they wouldn't have problems. That is a sort of like way of washing our hands before some of the most important abuses that we see in our labor markets. And that's simply not a good answer. Every job must be decent, and thinking that if we re-upskill and we retrain people, things are going to go better. And that's going to be enough. I think it's magical thinking, and it has nothing to do with sound labor policy. We need better enforcement. We need better application of the rights that we have. And then we also need upskilling and training, but that's not enough.
On that note, there are additional questions, but I'm afraid we have reached the end of the time. So I'm not even trying to summarize all the rich discussion that you have had. I think we can end with what Valerio said. We need better enforcement. We also need to get away from deterministic discourses that say that the ongoing trends in the world of work are unavoidable. Better enforcement, a universal labor guarantee, and overall more respect for the rights of workers who have less and less of a voice. Yes, thanks so much to the three of you for the last hour and a half. Thanks so much to all participants, and we look forward to the next event.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Wenyan, I'm sorry. Can we leave?